Hello, welcome back. In this presentation, we're going to do a very quick overview of proficiency-based instruction as it appears in the effective instructional sequence. The goals of this presentation are to provide an overview of the best practices model for designing language instruction, also known as the EIS, to provide participants with opportunities to begin reflecting on this model and its application in their own work, and finally, to set the stage for more detailed study and discussion of this model in the later modules. Each of the future modules will take one section of the EIS and use that as their focus. First of all, what is the EIS? Literally, it is an acronym that stands for Effective Instructional Sequence, and it is the best practices model for world language instruction and lesson design. It starts with a category that we call begin with the end in mind, meaning start with where you want to end up and let that drive the rest of your planning. It's also sometimes called backwards design. Following that is the setting of the stage. Teachers plan how they're going to do comprehensible input, which also includes frequent and varied checks for understanding. Following comprehensible input, there are a variety of guided practice activities that are engaged in, followed by independent practice where students begin to demonstrate what they can do themselves. And finally, we come back to the end with our assessment, extension, and application. So let's look a little bit more closely at begin with the end in mind. First of all, what does it mean? Well, what it means is you want to think of what is your end product going to look like. In other words, what is your functional objective for the students? What can they do with the language? Then you're going to design your assessments for those objectives before you attempt to design lesson components. Why is this important? Well, bottom line, a lesson can often get off track. If we don't have a clear vision of the roadmap of where we're going, you and your students don't have an idea of are we on that track still? So we need to know where the lessons are eventually going to end up in order to be very clear to the students as well as to ourselves. Setting the stage is an interesting part of the EIS. It's very quick and attention-grabbing. It is literally going to perhaps take 1 or 2 minutes, and it may have no language at all because it may be just simply displaying a series of pictures related to what you're going to talk about. The idea is that this is a way to engage the students and get their brains ready to take in the input that you're going to provide by making them question and wonder about the lesson. Comprehensible input is a major part of any lesson. It is always in the target language, never with translation into English. It is contextualized, so there needs to be a reason for this information, and it's connected to the functional objective. There will be frequent checks for understanding in a variety of formats. Following comprehensible input, we move to guided practice, which is an activity also in, or a series of activities also in the target language, both teachers and students. We make it as contextualized as possible. Here we're doing very often discrete item practice, and so it might be a little more challenging to provide a true world context, but we tried to do that. It is definitely related to the functional objective. It's something that will contribute to being able to accomplish that. And typically there is a clear-cut right or wrong answer, so we can immediately tell, is the student on the right track? It provides immediate feedback for the teacher and students, and it gives us some data, formative data, to ensure that students are ready to move on into independent practice. Independent practice, as the word may indicate, is going to be more with the students on their own. It is in the target language, contextualized, and here it's going to be meaningful and open-ended, meaning the student needs to be able to understand the language in order to negotiate meaning in communication. It is always related to the functional objective, and it is starting to look more like what the assessment will be. So that brings us to the end where we began, the assessment, extension, and application. Assessments are always authentic and contextualized. There needs to be a reason for the communication. It's not simply filling in the correct answer. This usually has a performance component to it. Assessments often provide summative data, meaning end of unit or end of lesson data regarding the student's proficiency, and they often have multiple components that are related to the functional objective. Assessment, extension, and application in particular provide opportunities within and beyond the classroom to use the language. So extension and application are the opportunities outside of the classroom to use the language. And this part of the EIS needs to provide the much more real-world application of the language skills. It may be in a context of imagine that, but nevertheless, it needs to be a context where the students could see themselves using language in that setting in the future. So in conclusion, this has been a very quick overview of the EIS. The remaining modules in the Online Foundations program are going to concentrate on dissecting and taking apart each of these individual pieces of the EIS to look at them more in depth with concrete examples of how that looks in a classroom and how you can apply this to your lesson design. Your ultimate final project will be to design a lesson using these components, identifying the different components of the EIS that will be in your lesson. I'd like to thank you for joining me and remind you that your next steps are to complete the very few remaining modules in module or activities in Module 2 Part 2. Mostly they are composed of some of the end of module surveys, and then to get ready to dive into the effective instructional sequence with our first live session, or with a Module 3 beginning with the end in mind, which opens very soon.